Hey guys, tonight we begin with something soothing, something gentle, something that says civilization has peaked and is now quietly collapsing. So dim the lights, maybe grab a blanket, and let's drift back to the year 410. CE Rome is still technically the center of the world. Emphasis on technically, the marble is cracked, the treasury is wheezing, and the emperors are mostly decorative. It is, in short, a perfect bedtime story. Now, when people hear fall of the Roman Empire, they imagine roaring barbarians, flaming rooftops, dramatic last stands, and someone clutching a scroll while shouting about civilization. In reality, it was much slower, much more awkward, and far more bureaucratic. Rome did not fall over dramatically. It sort of slumped, like a grand marble statue that had been leaning slightly to the left for 300 years and finally decided, you know what? Done. By the early 5th century, the Western Roman Empire was not the unstoppable machine it had once been. Taxes were high. Armies were expensive. Emperors came and went with alarming frequency. Some ruled for years, some for months. A few probably did not finish decorating their offices. The empire was large, overstretched, and permanently exhausted, which is never a good state to be in when you live next door to several large groups of people who would quite like some land and maybe a little respect. And to the Goths. Specifically, they were not cartoon villains. They were not howling maniacs who woke up every morning and chose chaos. They were, inconveniently for Rome, refugees. Back in the late 4th century, they had fled from an even scarier group called the Huns. And if you are fleeing the Huns, you are not doing it for fun. You are doing it because the alternative is worse. The Goths asked Rome for permission to cross the Danube and settle inside imperial territory. And Rome, in one of its more optimistic moods, said yes, because why not invite tens of thousands of heavily armed, nervous newcomers into your already fragile system? What could possibly go wrong? The deal was simple. The Goths would settle peacefully. They would farm. They would provide soldiers. Rome would provide food and protection. It was supposed to be mutually beneficial. It did not go well. Roman officials, who had perfected the art of corruption, decided to exploit the Goths. Food supplies were mismanaged. Prices were inflated. There are even reports of desperate Goths being forced to trade their children into servitude in exchange for rotten dog meat, which is not exactly how you build trust with your new neighbors. Shockingly, resentment grew. In 378 CE, the tension exploded at the Battle of Adrianople. The Roman army marched out, confident as always, and was soundly defeated. Emperor Valens himself was killed. It was one of the worst military disasters Rome had suffered in centuries. And from that moment on, it became clear that the empire was no longer the invincible giant of old. It could bleed quite easily. In fact, let's gently float forward a few decades. The Goths are still inside the empire, still restless, still negotiating, and among them, Riz's a leader named Alaric. He had actually grown up within the Roman system. He had served in the Roman army. He understood Roman politics, which made him far more dangerous than someone who simply wanted to smash things. Alaric wanted recognition. He wanted land for his people. He wanted an official position. Rome, being Rome, stalled, negotiated, promised, delayed, reconsidered, promised again. It was the imperial specialty. Alaric marched into Italy more than once, trying to pressure the imperial court. And it is important to note that by this time, the Western Roman capital was no longer in Rome. It had moved to Ravenna, a marshy, defensible city that was excellent for hiding emperors. So while Rome still had its ancient prestige, it did not have an emperor physically present to defend it. It was like a grand museum city. Impressive, historic, slightly neglected. In 410 CE, after years of failed negotiations and mounting frustration, Alaric and his Visigoths surrounded Rome. The city had not been successfully sacked in nearly 800 years. 8 centuries. That is a long time to assume you are untouchable. The walls were still strong, but morale was not. Food grew scarce. Panic simmered. Senators debated. Because of course they did. When in doubt, Rome formed a committee. Eventually, the gates were opened. Whether by treachery or desperation, we cannot say for certain. And the Visigoths entered the Eternal City. For 3 days, they seized treasures. They took valuables. They damaged symbols of Roman pride. Compared to some ancient conquests, it was not total annihilation. Many churches were respected. Some areas were spared, but the psychological blow was immense. Rome had been breached. The unthinkable had happened. The sack of Rome in 410 did not instantly end the Western Roman Empire. It staggered on for several more decades, limping toward its official end in 476. But symbolically, the damage was done. The idea of Rome as the eternal, unshakable center of the world had been shattered. People across the Mediterranean were stunned. Even St. Augustine felt compelled to write the City of God, partly in response, trying to explain how such a catastrophe could happen in a Christian empire. The vibes, as we might say, were not good. And yet, here is the strangely sleepy part. The Visigoths did not stay to rule Rome. They moved on. They eventually settled in Gaul and Spain. They built their own kingdom. They became, in time, less barbarian invaders and more new regional administrators with slightly different fashion. History has a way of smoothing out the drama. Today's catastrophe becomes tomorrow's chapter heading. So, as we rest here in the quiet after 410, we see something almost anticlimactic. No single dramatic explosion, no final trumpet blast. Just a slow unraveling, an empire stretched too thin. Leaders who miscalculated. Refugees treated badly, negotiations handled poorly, and a city that had believed, for centuries, that it could never truly fall. It turns out that even the mightiest systems are still run by humans, and humans are very good at making things complicated. Now remember, the Western Roman Empire did not end in 410. That would have been far too clean. Instead, it lingered, like a grand dinner party that technically ended hours ago. But no one has found the courage to turn off the lights. The emperors kept being appointed. Titles were handed out. Coins were minted. Official speeches were made. But the substance behind the ceremony was thinning out. At this point, the real power in the Western Empire often rested not with the emperor, but with military men with impressive mustaches, and even more impressive titles, like Magi. One of the most important was Stilicho, a half-handled general who had basically been running things before Alaric's sack. He was competent, which, in Roman politics, was suspicious. Eventually he was executed on charges of treason, because of course he was. Rome had a long tradition of eliminating the few people who knew what they were doing. After Stilicho's death, things became unstable. The army fractured. Loyalty became flexible. Provinces started looking out for themselves. Britain effectively drifted away from imperial control. Gaul was a patchwork of Roman officials, local warlords, and incoming groups who were not especially interested in paying Roman taxes. Meanwhile, the emperors were tucked safely in Ravenna. Ravenna was strategically brilliant, surrounded by marshes difficult to approach, easy to defend. It was less brilliant for projecting authority. The emperors there were insulated, removed, protected from immediate danger, which sounds nice, but it also meant they were protected from reality. Rome itself had become more of a symbol than a power center. Let's pause for a moment and appreciate how strange this must have felt to contemporaries. For centuries, Rome had been the gravitational center of the Mediterranean world. Its legions marched everywhere. Its laws shaped continents. And now, slowly, pieces were peeling away. Not in a dramatic explosion. More like tiles quietly falling from a very old roof. One emperor worth mentioning in this sleepy parade is Han. He was on the throne during the sack of 410. He ruled for a surprisingly long time, from 395 to 423. Long reigns usually suggest in this case, it mostly suggests that he stayed very well hidden. There is a famous story, possibly exaggerated but too poetic to ignore, that when Honorius heard that Rome has perished, he panicked because he thought his favorite chicken, named Roma, had died. When reassured that it was the city, not the poultry, he reportedly felt relief, whether or not this actually happened. The fact that people believed it tells you something about his reputation. While the Western Empire struggled, the Eastern Roman Empire, based in Constantinople, was doing significantly better. It had stronger finances, more defensible borders, more stable leadership. This contrast made the Western decline even more awkward. It was like watching one twin thrive while the other forgets to pay rent and sets the kitchen on fire. Across the Western provinces, new political realities were forming. The Visigoths settled in southern Gaul and later Spain. The Vandals moved through Gaul into Spain and eventually into North Africa. And North Africa was not just any province. It was a breadbasket. Losing it meant losing grain shipments that fed Italy, which is never good when your capital is already nervous and hungry. In 439, the Vandals captured Carthage. That was a serious blow. Carthage had once been Rome's greatest enemy during the Punic Wars. Now it was lost to a Germanic kingdom that controlled much of the Western Mediterranean's naval routes. Trade suffered. Revenue shrank. The Western Empire became even more dependent on whatever resources it could scrape together. And yet, daily life did not instantly collapse into chaos. This is important. Farmers still farmed. Merchants still traded. Churches still held services. People married, argued, complained about taxes, and worried about the weather. The end of an empire does not feel like the end of the world when you are living through it. It feels like inconvenience, gradual change, a sense that things are less reliable than they used to be. By the mid-5th century, the Western Roman Empire had become a shadow network of agreements. Roman generals negotiated with so-called barbarian leaders. Land was allocated in exchange for military service. Entire groups were settled as foederati, allied peoples who technically served Rome but increasingly operated autonomously. It was less an empire and more a loose confederation held together by tradition and hopeful paperwork. And then there was Attila, the Hun. We will not dwell too long on him, because that would disturb the bedtime rhythm. But suffice it to say, his presence added another layer of pressure. In 452, he invaded Italy. Cities were threatened. Fear spread, yet even Attila did not destroy Rome. The empire was not felled by a single unstoppable villain. It was worn down, negotiated into submission, squeezed from multiple angles until its structure simply could not hold its former shape. As we approach 476, we meet a young emperor with an almost poetic name, Romulus Augustulus. Little Augustus, even his name, felt like an echo of greater days. He was placed on the throne as a puppet by his father, Orus. The real power, again, lay elsewhere, this time with a Germanic commander named Odo. In 476, Odoacer deposed Romulus Augustus. The boy was not executed. He was sent into comfortable retirement, which is a surprisingly gentle ending for a Roman ruler. Odoacer did not declare himself emperor. Instead, he sent the imperial insignia to Constantinople and ruled Italy as king. The Western Roman Empire as a political entity with its own emperor, sympathy, and that was it. No dramatic final battle for Rome. No apocalyptic last stand justa deposition. A change in administrative labels. A quiet acknowledgement that the structure had already dissolved. Historians often debate whether 476 truly marks the fall. Because, in many ways, Roman institutions continued, laws persisted. The Church remained organized. The Eastern Empire still called itself Roman for another 1,000 years, but symbolically, the Western imperial line was finished. The ancient system that had once dominated Europe and the Mediterranean had transformed into something new. So, when we think back to Alaric's sack in 410, we can see it not as the explosive end, but as a milestone in a long process. A moment when the illusion of permanence was punctured. The Western Roman Empire did not collapse in a single roar. It exhaled. Slowly, over decades, and as we let that thought settle, we can appreciate how history rarely provides neat endings. It drifts, it shifts, it changes its name and keeps going. Rome did not vanish. It evolved, it fractured into successor kingdoms, it passed its legacy into medieval Europe. Let's just pause there for a moment, Because if you had told a Roman senator in the year 200 that one day a Gothic or Germanic king would rule Italy and keep Roman tax collectors on staff, he would have fainted directly into his wine cup. And yet, here we are. The so-called barbarians did not sweep in and erase everything. They inherited. They adapted. They discovered, quite quickly, that running a former superpower is complicated. Odoacer, the man who deposed Romulus Augustulus, styled himself as King of Italy, but he did not tear down Roman administration. He kept the Senate functioning. He maintained Roman law for Roman citizens. He understood that legitimacy mattered. If you want stability, you do not set fire to the filing cabinets. You o fe dem. Now, this blending of worlds is one of the most underrated parts of the so-called fall. We tend to imagine a hard line. Rome on one side, medieval chaos on the other. In reality, it was more like a slow cultural fusion. Gothic warriors married into Roman aristocratic families. Latin remained the language of administration. Bishops became political power brokers. The Roman Empire's skeleton stayed in place, even as new rulers wore different crowns. But, of course, no political situation remains stable for long. Enter Theodoric the Great, a man who sounds like he absolutely insisted on that title. Theodoric was king of the Ostrogoths, and in 493 he defeated Odoacer and took control of Italy. He had grown up as a hostage in Constantinople, which means he knew Roman culture intimately, admired Italiano, possibly even loved it in a slightly competitive way. Theodoric ruled Italy with remarkable restraint. He maintained Roman institutions. He supported infrastructure. Aqueducts were repaired. Grain supplies were organized. The Senate continued to function. He presented himself not as a destroyer of Rome, but as its guardian. It was almost wholesome. Almost, yet beneath the surface, tension simmered. The Ostrogoths were Arian Christians, while most Romans were Nicene Christians. Subtle theological disagreements can, as history has repeatedly shown us, turn into very unsubtle political problems. Trust was cautious. Cooperation was pragmatic. And then there is the figure of both a Roman aristocrat, philosopher, and official under Theodoric, brilliant, educated, very comfortable in the old Roman intellectual world, and, unfortunately for him, accused of treason. Theodoric eventually had him imprisoned and executed. It was a sobering reminder that even in this relatively stable hybrid kingdom, suspicion lingered. Old loyalties ran deep, and rulers, no matter how cultured, tended to get nervous. Meanwhile, beyond Italy, the map of Western Europe was transforming. In Gaul, the Franks were rising under Clovis. In Spain, the Visigoths established their kingdom. In North Africa, the Vandals controlled valuable territories and occasionally annoyed the Eastern Roman Empire with naval raids. These were not mindless hordes. They were organized kingdoms with courts, laws, and very serious hair. And here is where things get quietly ironic. Many of these barbarian kings were obsessed with Roman prestige. They minted coins in Roman style. They issued laws in Latin. They used Roman titles. The empire that had fallen was still the gold standard. Everyone wanted to inherit its aura. Let's float gently back to Italy. After Theodoric's death in 526, things became less smooth. Leadership weakened. Internal disputes grew. And then the Eastern Roman Empire, which we often call the Byzantine Empire, decided it might like Italy back. Under Emperor Justinian, a grand campaign of reconquest began in the mid-6th century. His general, Belisarius, marched west. And suddenly Italy became a battleground again. Gothic wars dragged on for years. Cities were besieged. Infrastructure was damaged. Populations suffered. It is one of history's quieter tragedies that Italy, which had survived the initial fall relatively intact under Theodoric, was devastated by an attempt to restore imperial glory. Justinian's dream of reconquest drained resources and left large regions exhausted. Sometimes, trying to rewind history causes more damage than simply letting it evolve. By the late 6th century, a new group arrived, the Lombards. They established their own kingdom in northern Italy, and by this point, the idea of a unified Western Roman Empire was more memory than reality. What remained were regional powers, Christian institutions, and Roman cultural threads woven into new political fabrics. And yet, through all of this, the Church grew steadily in influence. Bishops became community leaders. The Bishop of Rome, the Pope, gradually gained authority not just spiritually, but politically. In a world where imperial structures were unreliable, religious leadership provided continuity. If emperors were temporary, the Church felt permanent. So the fall of Rome did not produce a vacuum. It produced transformation. Power decentralized. Local identities strengthened. Germanic kings ruled Roman populations. Latin evolved into early forms of Romance languages. Law codes blended Roman precision with Germanic custom. It is tempting to label this period as the beginning of the Dark Ages, but that term, while dramatic, Yes, trade networks shrank. Yes, literacy declined in some areas. Yes, urban life contracted, but cultural exchange continued. Agricultural innovation persisted. Monasteries preserved classical texts. The world did not go dark. It simply changed lighting. And if we zoom out very gently, very calmly, we see that the sack of Rome in 410 was not an isolated apocalypse. It was a chapter in a long process of imperial adaptation. The Goths, who once stood outside the gates, eventually governed provinces. The Roman elites, who once feared invasion, negotiated positions within new regimes. Survival often looks less heroic and more administrative. By the time we reached the early Middle Ages, the memory of imperial unity lingered like a distant echo. People still referred to Roman law, still invoked Roman authority, still imagined, in some distant sense, that they were connected to that ancient center. And perhaps that is the softest irony of all. Rome fell, and yet it never quite disappeared. Its language shaped Europe. Its legal ideas endured. Its roads remained underfoot. Its church became a central pillar of medieval life. Even the kings who replaced emperors defined themselves in relation to Rome's shadow. So as we settle into the quiet aftermath of imperial decline, notice how undramatic it truly was. New finale curtain. No cosmic thunderclap. Just transitions, negotiations, adaptations. A world rearranging itself slowly enough that most people simply carried on. So let's gently turn our gaze eastward, because while the Western Empire was slowly unraveling, the Eastern Roman Empire was very much alive. Based in Constantinople, wealthy, organized, and surprisingly stable, it did not see itself as Byzantine. That is a later label. They were still Roman. Fully Roman. Capital R, they were probably slightly offended that anyone would suggest otherwise. And in the 6th century, we meet a man who absolutely believed Rome could be restored to its former glory. His name was Justinian. And if you have ever met someone who looks at a complicated, fragile situation and says, "You know what this needs? A massive expansion project," then you already understand his personality. Justinian ruled from 527 to 565. He had ambition, identity. He had an impressive legal mind. He also had a very patient and politically sharp wife, Theodora, who often steadied him when things became dramatic. Together, they oversaw one of the most ambitious attempts at imperial revival in history. Justinian believed the Western territories, Italy, North Africa, parts of Spain, still belonged, spiritually and legally, to Rome. They had simply drifted away. And so he launched campaigns to bring them back. His generals, especially Belisarius, marched westward. The Vandals in North Africa were defeated. The Ostrogoths in Italy were challenged. Territories were reclaimed. On paper, it looked impressive. Maps were redrawn. Roman authority was The old imperial dream flickered again. But here is the sleepy, slightly tragic twist. Reconquest is expensive. War drains treasuries. Armies consume resources. Cities caught in prolonged campaigns suffer. Italy, which had found a kind of stability under Gothic rule, became a prolonged battleground during the Gothic Wars. Urban centers declined. Infrastructure was damaged. Agricultural output suffered. In trying to restore Rome, Justinian strained the empire that still functioned. And as if that were not enough, there was also a devastating plague during his reign, what we now call the Plague of Justinian. It swept through the Mediterranean world, reducing populations and shaking economies. Not exactly ideal timing for a grand imperial comeback tour. And yet, Justinian's reign left something lasting. Not just territories, which would later be lost again, but law. He commissioned the Corpus Juris Civilis, a massive codification of Roman law. This legal project preserved centuries of legal thought and would influence European legal systems for generations. If the Western Empire had fallen politically, its intellectual structure was very much alive. Meanwhile, in the former Western provinces, new kingdoms were settling into their roles. Let's float gently to Gaul, where the Franks were consolidating power. Under Clovis, they had embraced Catholic Christianity, aligning themselves with the majority Roman population. It was a clever move. Religion, in this era, was not just personal belief. It was political glue. The Frankish kingdom grew. Over time, it would evolve into something more organized, more expansive. And centuries later, a Frankish king named Charlemagne would be crowned Emperor of the Romans by the Pope in 800, which is a beautifully ironic moment, because the Western Roman Empire had technically ended in 476. And yet here was a new ruler claiming the imperial title, as if history had simply paused and was now resuming. This tells us something important. The idea of Rome never truly died. It lingered in imagination, in ceremony, in law, in the church. Even in architecture, medieval rulers did not see themselves as living in a brand new world. They saw themselves as inheritors of an ancient one. Now, let's return briefly to Italy. After Justinian's reconquests weakened the region, the Lombards established their kingdom in the north. Italy became fragmented. Byzantine territories clung to parts of the peninsula. The Pope gained influence as a mediator and leader. Political unity was gone, replaced by a mosaic of powers. But daily life, again, did not feel like standing at the edge of history's cliff. Farmers tilled fields. Monks copied manuscripts by candlelight. Local lords managed estates. People adjusted. They always do. And here is the calm realization we arrive at. The fall of Rome was not a single disaster. It was a transformation of scale and structure. Authority shifted from centralized imperial control to regional kingdoms. The Roman identity did not vanish. It evolved into medieval Christian Europe. The Goths, Vandals, Franks, Lombards, they were not simply destroyers. They became rulers, lawmakers, and patrons. They married into Roman families. They adopted Roman customs. They shaped a hybrid civilization that carried pieces of both worlds. Even the language reflects this continuity. Latin did not disappear. It slowly transformed into the Romance languages, French, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese. The empire's voice softened, diversified, but endured. And so, as we rest here in the early medieval landscape, notice how quiet the transition feels. No grand cinematic collapse. No final slow-motion shot of marble crumbling into dust. Just a long process of adaptation. A reshuffling of power. A civilization adjusting to new realities. The sack of Rome in 410 was shocking. Yes, it symbolized vulnerability. It revealed cracks in the imperial armor. But it did not erase the world overnight. Instead, it marked a turning point in a centuries-long evil. History often prefers metaphors like fall or collapse because they sound dramatic. But in truth, Rome faded. It merged. It rebranded itself through other kingdoms. It survived in law, religion, and imagination. And as we slowly close this chapter of imperial decline, let your mind settle on that idea. The Roman Empire did not vanish in fire and chaos. It transformed into something quieter, something medieval, something new. So now we find ourselves in a world that no longer has a Western Roman emperor, at least not officially. The marble forums are quieter. The old imperial bureaucracy has thinned out, but the memory of Rome is still everywhere. It is in the language, in the church, in the way rulers describe themselves. No one wants to admit that the greatest brand in history has expired. And this brings us, gently, sleepily, to a tall Frankish king with an impressive beard and an even more impressive sense of destiny. His name was Charlemagne, or, if we are being formal, Charles the Great, which is already a confident choice of nickname. Charlemagne ruled the Frankish kingdom from 768 to 814. By the time he came to power, the Franks had grown into the dominant force in Western Europe. They controlled much of modern France and Germany. They were energetic, organized, very keen on expanding their territory. Charlemagne, in particular, seemed to wake up every morning and think, "What region shall we add today?" He expanded eastward against the Saxons, southward into Italy, westward into Spain. His campaigns were long, sometimes brutal, and often justified in religious terms. He was determined to spread Christianity across his realm, and if persuasion did not work, well, he had other methods. But let's keep our tone calm, because what matters here is not the battlefield drama. It is the symbolism. In the year 800, on Christmas Day, Charlemagne attended Mass in Rome. The Pope, Leo III, placed a crown on his head and declared him Emperor of the Romans Hustad. 3 centuries after the last Western Roman emperor had been quietly deposed, the title was back. Revived, rebranded. Slightly awkward. Now, from Charlemagne's perspective, this made sense. He controlled vast territories. He defended the church. He embodied stability in a fragmented Europe. From T-Pope's perspective, crowning a powerful protector was also convenient. It reinforced the idea that imperial authority came, at least in part, through papal blessing. From the Eastern Roman Empire's perspective, however, this was irritating. Irritating because they still considered themselves the true Roman emperors. Constantinople had never stopped. Its rulers had maintained the imperial line continuously since Antiquity, so suddenly having a Frankish king in the West calling himself emperor was a bit like someone else claiming your family title at a holiday dinner. And yet, the title stuck. Charlemagne's empire became known as the Carolingian Empire. It was not Rome reborn in the old sense. It lacked the centralized bureaucracy. It lacked the urban infrastructure. But it carried Rome's memory forward. It tried to revive learning, administration, and Christian unity. Charlemagne encouraged education. Monasteries and cathedral schools became centers of scholarship. Latin texts were copied and preserved. A standardized script, Carolingian minuscule, made writing clearer and more uniform. It is oddly comforting to realize that part of Rome's legacy survived because medieval monks had good handwriting habits. But like the Western Roman Empire before it, the Carolingian Empire struggled with succession. Charlemagne's heirs divided the realm. Internal disputes grew. Over time, the empire fractured into smaller kingdoms. France and Germany began to emerge as distinct entities. And so once again, we see a pattern. A strong ruler consolidates power. A grand imperial title is claimed. The system holds for a time, and then, gradually, it loosens. The dream of a unified Western Roman-style empire proved difficult to sustain. Geographies, local loyalties, and the practical limits of medieval administration made centralized control fragile. The old Roman infrastructure, roads, cities, tax networks, had never fully recovered from earlier disruptions. Yet the idea of empire did not vanish. It lingered in the Holy Roman Empire, which developed out of the Carolingian tradition. And, despite its grand name, it was neither particularly holy, nor entirely Roman, nor consistently unified. It was more of a patchwork of territories loosely connected under an emperor, a symbolic continuation rather than a direct restoration. Meanwhile, in Italy, the papacy continued to grow in influence. The Pope was not merely a religious leader. He was a political actor, a diplomat, sometimes a landholder. In a Europe without a single dominant secular authority, spiritual leadership filled gaps. This shift is one of the most important long-term consequences of Rome's fall. In the ancient empire, political power was centralized in the emperor. In medieval Europe, authority was distributed among kings, nobles, bishops, and the church. It was messier, more local, more personal, but perhaps also more adaptable. Let's gently zoom out. Now, from Alaric's sack of Rome in 410 to Charlemagne's coronation in 800, nearly 4 centuries have passed. In that time, The Western Roman Empire ended. Germanic kingdoms rose. The Eastern Empire endured. Italy changed hands, and a new imperial title emerged in the West. Was this the fall of Rome, or its transformation? If you had asked a Roman citizen in 300 what the future would look like, they would not have predicted Frankish kings, Lombard dukes, or popes crowning emperors. And yet, those developments carried forward Roman law, Roman religion, and Roman identity in altered forms. History rarely moves in straight lines. It loops, it borrows, it reuses old symbols for new purposes. And here, in the soft quiet of early medieval Europe, we see the long shadow of Rome stretching across centuries. The empire that once dominated the Mediterranean no longer exists in its ancient form, but its ghost sits in coronation ceremonies, in Latin prayers, in legal codes, in the very concept of Europe as a connected civilization. So as we settle into this final reflection for tonight's drifting journey, remember the fall of Rome was not a single night of fire and ruin. It was a gradual human process. Decisions made, mistakes repeated, adaptations attempted, titles reshaped. Alaric's Visigoths did not end civilization. They stepped into a changing world. The Western emperors did not all fail spectacularly. They managed decline as best they could, and later rulers, like Charlemagne, reached back into the past to claim Rome's prestige for themselves. Empires rise, empires fall, but ideas, especially powerful ones, tend to linger. And if you imagine those ancient Roman roads under a medieval sky, you can almost see it. The stones are older than the kingdoms that now sit upon them. The name Rome is spoken in churches far from the city itself. And history continues, steady and unhurried, long after the marble has cracked. So let your thoughts drift there, to a quiet Italian landscape, to the echo of distant bells, to an empire that never quite admitted it was gone.
Today we will talk about a very old history topic. This story is from a time when there were no house, no cities, no schools and no books. This is the story of fire. Fire is not just a thing but that burns. Fire changed everything. Fire made human different from animals. Without fire, there would be no food like today, no protection, no progress, and maybe no modern world. This is the story of how fire slowly changed human life step by step. Long, long ago, humans were very weak. They had no clothes, no proper homes, and no weapons. They lived in forest and open land. They were always afraid. Big animals hunted them, cold weather hot there, dark nights scared them. Human ate raw food. Raw meat was hard to chew. Raw plants were bitter and dangerous. People got sick easily. Many people died young. Life was very hard. The first time humans saw fire. Yes, fire was not first made by human. Fire came from nature. Lighting heat trees, volcanoes burned land, dry forest caught fire. Early humans saw fire from far away. They saw bright light. They felt heat. At first, they were scared. Fire was dangerous. Fire burned skin. Fire destroyed trees. But humans are curious. They watched fire carefully. Slowly, humans understood something important. Fire is dangerous, but fire is also useful. Fire give heat, fire give light. People start keeping fire interested of running away. They carried burning wood from natural fire. They portrayed that fire carefully. If fire dead, life became hard again. Fire became like a friend. Fire and warmth. Cold weather was deadly before fire. Winter killed many people. People slept at night. Fire changed this. Fire kept human warm and people could live in a colder place. They could travel to new lands. Fire helped humans survive winter. This was a very big change in history. Fire and light. Before fire, night was very dark. Darkness brought fear. Wild animal hunted at night. Fire brought light. People could see at night. They could stay together. They could talk and think. This helped humans before social. This helped humans share idea. Fire created community. Fire and protection. Fire scared wild animal. Animal were afraid of flame. They stayed away from fire. Humans used fire as protection. They slept near fire. This saved many lives. Fire became a side. Fire and cooked food. This was one of the biggest change in human history. Yes, human learned to cook food. Cooked meat was soft. Cooked plant were safe. People became stronger. Their brains grew bigger. Good food gave more energy. Scientists believe Cooking helped human become intelligent. Fire helped create the human brain. Fire and tools. Fire helped humans make tools. They hardened wood in fire. They shaped stone using heat. Later, fire helped me melt metal. This lead to copper tools. They bronze tools. They iron tools. Fire started technology. Fire and caves. Human lived in caves. Caves were dark and cold. Fire made caves livable. Fire kept animal away. Fire gave light inside cave. Human painted on cave walls using firelight. This was early art. This was early culture. Fire and social life. Fire brought people together. People sat around fire, they talked, they shared stories. This was the beginning of language, this was the beginning of tradition. Fire created human society, learned to make fire. At first, human protected natural fire. Later, they learned to make fire. They rubbed stones, they rubbed wood. This was a huge discovery. Now fire was always available. Human we are no longer dependent on nature. This was the freedom. Fire and migration. Fire allowed humans to move. They went to good lands. They crossed mountains. Fire helped humans spread across the world, from Africa to Asia, from Asia to Europe, from Europe to everywhere. Fire helped humans conquering that plant. Fire and religion. Fire became scared. People believe fire was a magic. People worshipped fire. Yes, many religions used fire. Fire rituals started. Fire became a symbol of life. Fire and farming. Fire helped clear forest. People burned land. This made farming possible. Yes, farming changed human life. People settled down. Villages formed and cities were born. Are you know? Fast start civilization. Fire and industry. Thousands of years later, fire powered machine, fire boiled water, steam and gas were born. Factors started, trains moved, fire became energy. Fire and modern world. Today, fire still help us. Electric comes from fire. Cooking or users use fire. Industries uses fire, and fire still saves human life. Conclusion: fire is not just that the fire is the history. Fire made humans human. Without fire, there would be no civilization, no cities, no technology. Fast is the greatest discovery in human history. This, thank you. Today, now this is a very interesting story. I am feeling very relaxed now, because I am try to very best now to please subscribe, like, and comment. Thank you. Today we will talk about a very old history topic. This story is from a time when there were no house, no cities, no schools, and no books. This is the story of Fire. Fire is not just a thing, but that burns. Fire changed everything. Fire made human different from animals. Without fire, there would be no food like today, no protection, no progress, and maybe no modern world. This is the story of how fire slowly changed human life step by step. Long, long ago, humans were very weak. They had no clothes, no proper homes, and no weapons. They lived in forest and open land. They were always afraid. Big animals hunted them, cold weather, hot there, dark nights scared them. Human ate raw food. Raw meat was hard to chew. Raw plants were bitter and dangerous. People got sick easily. Many people died young. Life was very hard. The first time humans saw fire. Yes, fire was not first made by human. Fire came from nature. Lighting, heat, trees,